Hello everyone, and welcome back to Fugitive Chefs Podcast, the podcast where we talk to chefs, food innovators who've stepped outside traditional restaurant kitchens to build new ways of working in food. Some of them go through research, fermentation, sustainability to get some sort of creative independence. Today's guest is Lorenzo Tirelli, R&D Manager at Reduced in Copenhagen. It's a company turning upcycled ingredients into deeply flavorful fermented broths using koji and classical fermentation. Lorenzo's journey spans dropping out of pharmaceutical chemistry, then chefing across Rome, Uruguay, France, Tuscany, and becoming a fermenter at Noma. And then he earned an MSc in Food Innovation and Health. And all of this mix has led him to his current role, which bridges craft, science, and sustainability. So welcome to the podcast, Lorenzo. Thanks so much for accepting this invite.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm really excited to be here and as part of the community of professionals that you have already invited previously in this podcast, and to share something of what I've been doing, what I'm doing up until now that can inspire others. And maybe I'm always open for being contacted in the future and kind of clear out some of the more kind of tricky steps that led me where I am today. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, the podcast is all about those tricky steps. And as you said, the episode is basically going to find out how did you end up in this role that you are, and also finding the impact of role people like you when they step outside the brigade. What happens? How do you rethink the food system altogether? Because again, restaurant can be quite a tunnel when you work in restaurants. Your idea of food is very limited to what you serve on the menu. And also to talk about a little bit about fermentation, the technological part of things that you're using, and building this new sort of a kind of chef identity. Also to question, like, if you see yourself today as a chef or not, how close or far is today's role to that role back then where you started in the kitchen. So before we dive into all of that, Lorenzo, tell us about the beginning. Like, how did it happen that you left pharmaceutical chemistry and pivoted into food?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Sure. I was part of what one could think of as a mainstream development path that many people around the world embark on through high school and then college and then going to full-time 9 to 5 work. And I think that idea for me, after a few years of frustration, started daunting me, and I felt like I wanted to do something more practical with my hands and see the results of my work much more quickly. And so, as I told you earlier, we spent some time studying pharmaceutical chemistry for about 2 years in the Rome University of Sapienza. And at some point I looked at this massive book that I had in front, and I thought, like, what the hell am I gonna do with this? And I was learning about molecules and different structures of molecules according to how you look at them. And that really kind of, put me off, and everything was going great. I had good grades and I was happy in a way to be around peers that were enjoying what they were doing, but I needed something extra. And so I embarked on this culinary journey, first as a student of gastronomy in an Italian hotellerie school that I was part of through European funds. And we went through like a 9 months program of savory dishes, starters, and entrees, mains, and some patisserie and bread making, kind of like a general, background to get some confidence with working with food. And then I jumped right into it. One of my first experience, more formative ones, was at the Rome Sustainable Food Project, which is a food project started off from Alice Waters, the vice president of Slow Food in Rome, and more precisely in the American Academy in Rome. And it's a very, simple program of feeding the community of scholars that are hosted into the Academy with farm-to-table foods, with the most, pristine and delicious produce of the surroundings of Rome. And that's kind of where I got started, working with the idea of farm to table, but also like making the most out of produce that, was cared for and people spent time working with. So we used a lot of leftovers. We transformed today's, main course into tomorrow's soup.
Oh, wow.
And we had a lot of, ideas to make the most out of what this nutrition, the food was.
And when you started on these restaurants and also with doing this course around gastronomy, was your idea, the exposure was to work in restaurants? I mean, you found this very good, like a very niche place, I think, which is a little
Yeah,
far from a restaurant. It's a conceptual project behind it. But the careers in
for
your
sure.
mind in that sense were being in restaurants or to.
Yeah, no, I was definitely convinced that, I wanted to have like a straight, a straightforward career
Uh-huh.
in back then I wanted to become a chef. I wanted to work in a restaurant and be somewhat respected in the community of chefs around the world. But then, life happens and it's a series of circumstantial decision making and random, events that happen. So I jumped into this smaller, more niche program that I was just telling you about, the Rome Sustainable Food Project, which I was happy with. It was in my hometown. I was, gaining confidence, and that was kind of, a 15-minute drive from my place. And
Uh-huh.
I was working with other people that wanted to learn how to cook, and there were some good chefs as head chefs and executives. And it was kind of a protected environment where I was allowed to do mistakes and also try out new things. And that's where it started. And as again, by coincidence, there was we were hosting an intern
Uh-huh.
in that period, and it happened that this intern was the sous chef of Francis Malman's restaurant Garçon in
Right.
Uruguay.
Mhm.
And I had no idea about who Francis Malman was or about who this chef coming to visit us came for. And but at some point she was like, we were making pasta shoulder to shoulder,
Uh-huh.
and she was like, oh, why don't you come and spend the season with us in Uruguay and cook some Argentinian food with fire. And I was like, I mean, it sounds great. Like I wanted to, learn more, and I just said yes. And, a couple of months after, I found myself in Uruguay. Yeah, that was 2015, I
Okay.
think. Yeah, almost 10
And
years ago, a
what's the
little.
exposure like? Because again, being a chef, I mean, that's what we all of us share. That a lot of other careers, I feel, are sort of jealous of us because traveling is easy. I mean, you're not like if a title of being a banker in Rome, and you can't practice banking in the Bank of America suddenly in the States. So like being a chef gives you that flexibility to be able to get into cultures and learn about them. But how was your perception of restaurants once you got there? Because again, being somebody who grew up in your country, working in a restaurant, stepping into Francis Mallmann, who's he's a culinary massive figure in Uruguay. So how are restaurants like those? How did that treat you?
I think, back then the excitement of leaving my country and started to do the career, like
Uh-huh.
for real, overwhelmed me. And it's at the same time just kept my expectations very low,
Mm.
because like what I had in front was fully, unknown. I
Got
didn't know the country. I never have been in Uruguay. I
Uh-huh.
I knew the restaurant was like 2 hours inland, and I had to get there with like two planes, a ferry, a bus, and
Wow.
then I was eventually picked up on like a street, a highway,
Uh-huh.
and then drove into the mainland for some time to the restaurant. So I really didn't know what I was going to crash into. And I also didn't really know much about Francis Malman. It's funny because a few days later he was teaching me how to cut milanesas, which
Mhm.
are basically schnitzels
Yeah.
or cotoletta
Yeah.
in Italian, out of like this massive beef rack,
Mhm.
because we were opening a new restaurant nearby. And he was just next to me telling me, hey, Lorenzo, it needs to be this thick. And of course, it's Francis Malman. So his Milanesa was like 3 centimeters thick, and I was like slicing it next to him. And I thought that was great. I mean, I had no idea that someone like him of his
Uh-huh.
caliber would be teaching me something about his Argentinian food traditions and some of his dishes. So that for me was really, I mean, some of the most formative experiences as well. Next to that, the fact that there is no gas in his kitchen
Mhm.
is another pretty interesting, element that I completely didn't know I was going to have to work with.
Uh-huh.
We were lighting, burning wood in these old stoves and cooking directly on the stove tops. Out on the street, we were making these massive fires that, if you have seen Chef's Table,
Of course. Yeah.
they're enormous structures of fire under the soil, smoking on top. And that was, yeah, that was a blast. I mean, it was again like my second experience in a kitchen, or my third experience, and I mean, what I got out of that was
Yeah, I mean that's getting deep into like also like a very of a high caliber chef, as you said, but also like getting into the depth of cooking the way it is, like getting away from the whole technological part, which is your reality today, and then getting into the whole primitive sort of these ancestral techniques and the way they cook. I think getting into it, I think is as
yeah.
you said, it's given you a lot to carry forward. But then also like apart from that, you've also had exposure around Europe. You've traveled a lot in restaurants like these. In today's work that you do, I mean, which we'll get into more of, like what's your day to day today like, but how much of this cooking the years of working in France, Tuscany, and Uruguay, how much of that have you carried forward and it comes of use in your career right now?
Yeah. I think what sticks with me up until today from back then is the passion and the comfort of flavor. So is how I thought about flavor, and how I, in those early years, I trained myself to tasting flavors that were wholesome, that were simple, and that other people could relate to. It was both in these first three experiences that we were discussing.
Uh-huh.
It was a very straightforward approach to food. There was no additives, there was no mixing too much, there were no E numbers. It was produce, simple, I would say almost minimal processing on a stovetop, on a plancha, grilled, and then on the plate. And I don't know if you know about Malman's, one of his, you know, famous sayings is that he wants the guest of the restaurant to make an effort to
Yeah.
eat their food. So that's why he serves like half pumpkins on a
Oh.
plate, or a huge piece of meat that you actually need to cut and carve to eat yourself. And I
Mhm.
think that stays with me. I mean, today reduced uh, goes to, promotes itself for being additive free,
Right.
for making natural foods, for making fermented foods that, taste good and people can relate to. It could be something that anyone has made at home, but, made in a larger scale production facility. So I think a lot of those principles that I, got started to familiarize almost a decade ago
Uh-huh.
are still resonating to this day. And I think that that's something that I don't think it could have been otherwise.
Uh-huh.
Those are part of also my personality as a human. That's the food that I like. That's the approach that I want to have to food, but also to other things. And so, it was difficult. It was random how I got
Uh-huh.
until reduced, but at some point it came together for me, and I'm happy to be where I am.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you narrate it the way you do it and the way you say you pick up those parts of like I think flavor itself. I feel a lot of companies, I would say like yours, a lot of food tech world in itself is definitely a lot about e numbers and a lot about like things that are controllable. At the end of the day, the work that you did before, which is working with fire, for example, to start with, is something you can't control it. Again, you think that you become a master of it and you can pivot it in the way you want. But I feel flavors still to a certain extent do have this natural take on how you modify them, on the way you cook, the way, I mean, I don't know, in Indian cuisine, for example, how early you put the oil, or in Italian cuisine, how you process the tomatoes, what time of the year it is. It does define a lot of flavor, which again, it's very difficult to translate these things. And I feel such an approach that you have, I bet the way you're narrating it adds this extra layer of somebody who thinks like a chef and then works in a
Right.
place where you have to scale up things, I guess, where you can't just be random about things.
A lot, for chefs, like, that work with produce and quality produce, for that matter,
Uh-huh.
like a lot has to do with sourcing and knowing your surroundings. And I think that part is a lot more difficult to bring in a food tech startup like Reduced.
Uh-huh.
You where, of course, like if you use a beautifully grown leek or pumpkin, that flavor is going to be carried on to the plate, and the guests will be able to appreciate it. But how, food tech, because of the requirements on consistency at production scales that are massive, you tend to you know, how do you say, homogenize and
Hmm.
standardize flavors. So that's the part that we're always working with at Reduce that is also challenging, right? You want to find the right source of upcycled leeks or carrots, and the producer who doesn't use additives and doesn't use any you know chemicals in their production methods, if
Hmm.
that is the case. And the second element, which I mean, I'm just gonna drop it and then we can go
Hmm.
to it later on, is of course fermentation, because we use fermentation and solid state fermentation as a way to enhance the inherent flavors of the food that we process in our facilities. And that is, again, I mean, of course, if we didn't have good flavors to start with, it would be kind of, not counterintuitive to enhance those and then bring them to a consumer. But we use koji because koji enhances aromas and koji enhances taste,
Hmm.
and that's the approach, right? We start with some carrots, we start with leeks or chicken for that matter, and we kind of try to lift those flavors and bring them to the consumer.
Interesting. And when you mention about fermentation, I mean, how was your exposure to fermentation first? Like, I mean, you grew up in Italy, you have cheese, wine, bread all around you. But when I talk about like things like koji, which are alien to European culture, have been bought to fine dining scene by restaurants like Noma, not them being the first one, but them kind of putting books out on it and making it so prominent on their menus. How was that experience like? What did you know basically about fermentation before going to Noma, and then what changed when once you enter there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and as you say, Italians live around fermented foods, and
Hmm.
so I have myself cheese, wine,
Yeah.
beer. But you don't think about it necessarily as a fermented food. In fact, I think it happened a few times that I told to someone, well, you eat fermented foods all the time.
Hmm.
Think about Parmesan cheese.
Yeah.
And they were like, really? Oh, yeah, I guess it is fermented. But I didn't know that much about the kind of fermentations that Noma uh, uses these days, which are usually and mostly Asian inspired kinds of fermentation from Japan, Korea, China, mostly. I knew more about, fermentations that were closer to the area and the geographical places that I lived in, which, for example, the most known one is colatura
Mhm.
di alici, which is, this fermented fish sauce
Right.
that was very popular back up until in the Roman
Mhm.
times, where excess lean fish like sardines or anchovies were fermented in open terracotta or ceramic vats for months and months, and then the drippings of this fermented broth were used to season foods
Mm.
on the table, and it could have been both savory and sweet, which is kind of funny. But this umami rich fish based sauce actually fits both, an omelette or a frittata, but also some sort of cake with raisins and honey.
Mhm.
And then you can put it on both. And so that was the kind of fermentation that I was more familiar with.
Mhm.
This kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, now that we've got a halfway through, we have dropped some hints about what Reduce does, the way you've mentioned it. Tell us about Reduce as a company for somebody who doesn't know it. What does Reduce stand for, and what form of a business are you? It's B2B, B2C. How did it start, more or less?
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Reduced is a food tech scale up
Mhm.
that transforms upcycled food materials and ingredients into fermented sauces or broths.
Right.
So an example would be our vegetable stock, which comes from carrot tops, carrot bottoms, apple cores, third grade leeks
Mhm.
that we ferment together with koji, and then that product we process a little bit further in the downstream moment, and we use as a fermented stock.
Mhm.
You can cook with it. You can make risotto, dressings, sauces. make curries, and whatsoever. Reduce is a company that was founded in March 2020, so it's relatively young.
Uh-huh.
And while in the early days it was focused on B2C, so consumer focused company, today it's mostly B2B.
Okay.
And so we focus on food manufacturers and actually mostly restaurants, canteens, large hotels,
Right.
conference centers, or public institutions that serve food. Could be hospitals or schools, for example.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and it's when I joined the company, I was the actual first technical employee of the
Uh-huh.
company, and with a chef's background, knowing about food and flavor and fermentation. And now we are about 30 people
Wow.
full time. So it grew extensively over the past 3 to 5 years. It's a venture capital funded company.
Right.
And yeah, our mission is to bring delicious fermented broths to food manufacturers that are looking for additive-free, natural, wholesome flavors to make and develop the foods of the future.
Uh-huh. And to understand the circle, Lorenzo, like how circular is this? Like, where is the food waste basically coming from? Is it coming from the same canteens, or is it like large frozen vegetable producers, or where's it coming
No, exactly. So a lot of, yeah, so that's a question that we get all the time because of course when we talk about supply
from?
and
Right.
the supply of reduced ingredients, we need to provide some sort of stability.
Uh-huh.
And that stability, of course, is hard to achieve when you work with smaller restaurants or canteens, but it's easier to achieve when you have contracts with larger food producers or companies that make, for example, agricultural companies,
Right.
right? So that, for example, most of our vegetables come from a few companies that prepare ready to eat salads
Uh-huh.
and fruit salads.
Uh-huh.
So they process apples, they process leeks, they process carrots, and they throw out, the pieces that you don't want to find in a ready to eat salad. Those we kind of collect, we purchase, and then we transform. Uh, or for another matter, we work with broken rice
Uh-huh.
from Italy. This is rice that, again, that we work with a big distributor that collects rice from the agricultural northeast of Italy. And of course, in the process of polishing, there are broken kernels that cannot be integrated into, food packages. And we buy those and we use them for our koji, for example.
Mm-hmm. And another business related question, just for the people listening to also understand the business model and concepts like these, how do they work? Because again, they sound very easy on a paper level, but I think it has a lot of layers because again, as you said, the stability in the market, the quality of them, I guess you'd have to train the people to how to collect, how to process and send you these things. But moving on to like products like these, what is the motivation for these companies? Is it like the economic benefit? Is it corporate social responsibility? Is the EU law on food waste? Or is it just that?
Yeah, it's a mix of those for
Uh-huh.
sure. I mean, for companies that work within the EU boundaries is definitely the targets that we have put out as Europeans about reducing CO2 emissions
Uh-huh.
that push companies to work with reduced. And that's kind of the umbrella, let's say, scenario background that we're working within. But then singularly companies that we for sure also economically are looking for some extra revenue,
Uh-huh.
because you're throwing out, or you're almost paying to have food residues or production byproducts to be picked up and then upcycled or recycled. And then, another day reduced can buy them from you at a small, price. And then you can actually increase your revenue. And, that is a scenario that,
Uh-huh.
of course, will become more relevant when the company will also increase its volumes, right?
Definitely.
'Cause, I
Yeah.
mean, so that's also part of the picture, but definitely optimizing production cycles and production chains in
Uh-huh.
a large company is of great interest, to increase revenue mostly, yeah,
Yeah,
and
super
to also
interesting.
be able to claim that there is work being done
Of course.
towards, a more responsible food production system. But I think the economical factor is definitely the leading one. If those numbers can make sense when projected
Uh-huh.
by volumes attached and with the years to come, then there will be a collaboration that is gonna lead to some fruitful results.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel that's how it should be, because a lot of companies, when they go about sustainability, I feel the economic part gets left behind when it comes about stuff. I mean, of course, the big food companies, that's their first thing in mind, which is why the new ideas have to answer that question early on, so that it doesn't, if as long as it's economically viable, it will be sustainable in the longer chain of the game, you know. And I mean, my reason for
Right,
asking you these questions was also because I feel, to the beginning of the podcast, as you spoke about your food career as somebody growing up, moving on from chemistry to learning food, I feel the image of somebody listening again. A lot of people listen this on just on audio, so I feel as somebody who also listens a lot of podcasts, it's very difficult to understand profiles when it's about a career transition. So now we've spoken about your chef past, we've spoken about your current job, you know, which is very technical, a lot of business side to it. Also, even though your role is technical, it requires a lot of understanding the whole food system, especially in your company, how it works. And for me, now as somebody who's listening and has heard about this chef, we've skipped the part where you've also taken some sort of academic degree into getting into this role, you know. So tell us about that.
right.
How was the masters in studying in Copenhagen? Why Copenhagen? Because we also know the Danish education system happens to be, if I'm not wrong, it's kind of economically viable for Europeans, because
Right,
I think they have scholarships and ways to make it cheaper.
right.
Was it that?
Yeah,
Was it because of Copenhagen being a leader in this field, or what made you end up there?
yeah. I think, just to take even one more step before,
Mhm.
like the curiosity of understanding where does this food that I'm working with today in a kitchen comes from, and how was it farmed? Was it organic agriculture, biodynamic? Does the restaurant know the farmer? Were all questions that I was curious and motivated to answer at some point or another. And so, actually, when I was out in Uruguay, I had applied for a bachelor's education in Norway, which I got accepted, and I actually ended up moving over there to pursue a bachelor's in environmental and development studies.
Mhm.
So that it was a very broad picture about food systems included, but also politics of food, politics of development subsidies, kind of working with NGOs. They gave me like, broad strokes about kind of how the world functions when, economical and political and community interests are at stake. But I was missing the deep food education. That's why I went to Copenhagen after having this very broad, education in environmental studies. And in Copenhagen, the idea was to pursue the master's in food innovation and health to kind of narrow down my technical side to food flavors and to kind of also the business aspects of what it means to maybe start your own business. And as you said, I mean, I was interested in Copenhagen because the university is free for Europeans. You actually, I mean, it's free, and if you're working 10 to 12 hours a week in a business, you actually get also some subsidies from the state to kind of get by on a monthly basis because it is very expensive. But also, I was interested in Copenhagen because as a chef, at core, I was really kind of burning to experience firsthand this Nordic food culture movement that started, a few years before with restaurants like Noma, but even before that, other pioneers in, making the most of environments like the Scandinavian one, which were not necessarily valued much in the gastronomical scene. So those were kind of the motivations that brought me to Copenhagen and kind of pushed me to make the most out of this education. I mean, education is great, but it is only like a tool for someone to understand better or ask right questions. I think what really pushed me was the network that I managed to create in those years, and landing the internship at Noma was a key step to getting to Reduced, right? Because in August 2020, I was there with a friend of mine doing the internship. And at the end of it, I was offered a job in the fermentation lab, which I pursued for about a year. So working only in the fermentation kitchen, making misos, soy sauces, garums, kombuchas, all sorts of like other ferments and seasonings for the menu. And after about a year, I decided to leave to finish and wrap up my master's because I kind of put it on hold. I did a year of master's studies, then I got this internship, and then I was offered the job. And, I was thinking, well, this is like a massive opportunity for me. I'm open to give up my studies to stay at Noma and kind of do that career. But then after about a year, I understood that I actually needed to complete the degree, and it would have been much more valuable for me in the long run to have a master's degree. And so I went back to studying after about a year or so of Noma fermentation, and I completed that. And a few months later, the ex-director of fermentation at Noma, David Zilber, wrote to me on Instagram saying, hey, like, I know a couple of Danish guys that are trying to start like a company where fermentation and flavor and science are needed. Would you be interested in that? And I said, yes, of course. Like, put me in touch. I want to meet these guys. And that's how it happened. And, I didn't even know much David Zilber because he actually wasn't there when I was at Noma. He had already left.
Right.
Uh, but for some, contingencies, and Copenhagen is also a very small town,
Definitely.
it's people know each other. He was like so nice to just reach out. He, of course, probably knew a little bit about my background with science and food merging together
Right.
in technical and not so technical ways. And and he was, put me in touch with Emil and William, who are the founders of Reduced. And there we go. Here's almost 5 years later, working at Reduced now.
Yeah, I mean it's a very curious path that you've taken. I mean all of these things, as you yourself said, it's been random, but also it's been very, when you see the puzzle does fit each other. But Lorenzo, I want to hear from you, like as somebody who left science that got into kitchen, which again is a lot of science, but the kind of places you were was driven more by flavor and intuition, I think, and then ending up in this masters, going to Noma. How did you think the scientific, or I would say more than scientific, how do you think the masters has, which gaps in your profile do you think the masters has filled? Because again, doing the masters and going to say fermenting in Noma again, the way it ferments, it's for somebody very science led, it's not the right way to do things. It's what makes sense for Noma itself. So again, the approach of fermentation is very different, I think, because of how chefs think. They just fill the gaps
Yeah.
how they can. They don't really follow a logbook as much as science would like them to. But what did the masters give you that gave you that edge over, say, a regular chef, who just knows to cook?
Yeah, it's again, it's a good question, and unfortunately, still today, it's hard to provide like a clear
Mhm.
answer to it, because I really believe that the masters and allowing myself to study for two
Right.
years was really an opportunity to kind of be flexible and open to interests that would pop up
Right.
during and along that course, and to be a bit more practical and specific. The Masters of Food Innovation and Health at Copenhagen University has a number of credits that are open for the student to design at their own, let's say, interest.
Okay.
And so, of course, myself as the student needed to reach out to the labs or to a cool company that I was interested in and convince them to let me in to pursue that master. And I think that's the hard part.
Mhm.
So the masters allowed me to kind of, maybe fill those interests and kind of get those network, that connection. Because, once you're done with the master, the pressure builds in, and like, you
Mhm.
need to work. You're in Copenhagen and rent is really expensive, so you need to get a job quick. You don't have the time to write emails and try to get, in touch with people necessarily, when you're also, your peers are starting to get their careers going, and so on. That is one part. So what did the master help me, what did the masters in Copenhagen feel that I couldn't feel as a chef? Well, the time. I
Yeah,
mean, also as a chef, you don't get much time
of
off,
course.
and you eat standing up a lot of the times, and the breaks are like 20 to 30 minutes, and you're working 6 7 days a week. Now it changed, but
Mhm.
there is still, the rhythm is pretty high. So the
Definitely.
masters allowed me for time, and I
Mhm.
really valued that, because I did start working as a chef,
Mhm.
and I knew that time was such a precious resource. So I used it to get in touch with people that I thought were interesting, with professors that maybe were not teaching me, but had interesting connections to the food scene in Copenhagen. And the other part, for sure, was some of the elements of entrepreneurship and innovation. Right, my master's was focused on innovation and health, and so that part, for sure, was filled from my educational, let's say, path, that I did not get as a chef. So knowing what are the what does the big industry look for
Mhm.
when they're innovating? What are maybe nutritional components of foods that might be interesting for health in the long term? And then what do we need to change about the current food system that seems to be not working anymore, right?
Super
So
interesting.
so those elements I managed to pick up, and of course fermentation then came in as an answer, because a lot of fermented foods are foods that maybe have more bioavailable nutrients and elements. And as a company, as a startup, you want to advertise and market these as something good,
Mhm.
and something healthy. So I think these two components, ultimately, the masters help me with time,
Mhm.
putting time on my side, and getting to reach out and explore new things, and also the more innovative nutritional health aspects of making food, and then having, maybe putting a business on top of that, running a business based on food.
Yeah, yeah. I love what you've highlighted, Lorenzo. I mean, honestly, what you said about the time factor, I feel is something many of us don't realize, that how important, how nourishing it can be to also be able to get in these circles where you can network, possibly for a better career, for better, just inspire yourself by other people having different narratives about the food system, you know. But another question I had for you, Lorenzo, was like, because again, as I said before, the chef career, being a chef itself, is a lot about intuition. It's a lot about doing things randomly, whereas R&D, and when you have to especially scale a product up, it's very planned. So in this battle between craftsmanship of being intuitive and developing things without boundaries to scaling up, what do you think gets lost? Like when you want to translate something as a chef, which part is the most difficult to translate into a commercial product, especially with your experience now with reduced?
Yeah, it's a great question. Which part? There are a few parts that makes it difficult to scale. Sometimes the eagerness to process fails the upscaling cycle.
Right.
The eagerness to, for example, roast a carrot and then extract the flavors by doing maybe ice clarification
Uh-huh.
and then adding a miso into that to enhance the flavors. That already is way too complicated
Yeah.
for a startup or a company to upscale in larger volumes, right? We're talking about a company reduced that wants to go for the big markets, for mass markets. We're not doing necessarily our artisanal products. Our approach is artisanal in a way. That's the mission that we have, is to upscale an artisanal approach to like a mass production facility.
Right.
So we're not like the small fermentary that sells in boutique stores or nice delis around town. We want to sell, over the sea in the US, in Italy, and possibly in India and other in Australia. So you need to simplify a lot at the beginning of the process in order to avoid complications while upscaling the process and the product. That's one thing. And then the quality is always like the challenge, right? Like the flavors that you get in a test kitchen are hardly the same when you produce them at 10 or 100 times scale. And so, you need a lot of analysis, aroma analysis, taste analysis, that our flavor scientists help us with. So when we develop a product, we make it in a 10-liter bottle or a 5-liter bottle. And then we break it down into its aroma composition, into its taste composition, so we can see how much of this alcohol is present here, how much of glutamic acid is present in my, lab bench prototype. And then those values and those profiles we try to replicate at scale. And so we can see what are the gaps in aroma and in taste when we produce at 500 liter
Uh-huh.
or at 5,000 liters. And I think that's the main challenge.
Yeah, I mean, super
One
interesting.
other,
I mean, as you said, I feel measuring, as you mentioned, even though it sounds boring and sounds like something that limits us, I feel as chefs, especially those who work in R&D, those are a little bit different, like little bit apart from restaurants, but still working in a creative field. They find a lot of them who have met and have a chat with find the logging and the calculating, the measuring very boring and limiting, and some of them actually say that makes them less creative. But I feel in the end, that's the only way to assure that you're constantly creative and not just creative out of, yeah, randomly out of
yeah,
nowhere.
for sure. No, I totally agree. And also, I mean, having the details about your miso, your soy sauce, your fermented paste is what makes that paste unique. And so you cannot claim that, what you've done is one of a kind and is not replicable, because, you have a series that food is chemistry, and it's made of a lot of components, aromas, taste components that make that food unique. And so knowing about them is actually the only way, well, a really good way to be able to replicate those products that one is so proud of developing.
100%, 100%. And Lorenzo, like you have lived the life of being in academics, then being in kitchens, then taking a break, getting time to study again, now being in this food tech world. How would you say, as somebody, as just purely about work life balance or how your life is today, how do you see the life currently? What aspects would you highlight? And was the restaurant life that you used to live sustainable? Like, do you see, because you also recently became a parent, so do you see that would have been your reality right now? How sustainable was it for you as a person living that life?
Yeah. Yeah, for me, I need balance between work and personal life on a day to day.
Hmm.
And when I was working in restaurants back then, I was working maybe 6 days or 5 days and for many hours in a row. And I didn't have much personal time off during, my Tuesday or my Wednesday. And for me personally, that is very important because I need balance throughout. the week.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, then you push yourself to make time off even when you're working 14, 15 hours, but
Right.
that ends up straining you or straining me in the long run. And so
Uh-huh.
I definitely couldn't have the life that I have today if I kept being a chef, to answer your question
Uh-huh.
pretty, quickly. Um, and I think for me, it would have been too hard to pursue the chefing career at this point in life, with a family, for example, and also with the let's see the rights that I get as an employee of Reduced compared
Definitely.
to what I would have got as a chef in the kitchen. And I'm talking about workers' rights and uh, of course paychecks, but also as I told you earlier, I was allowed to take 5 months off from my company to be with my newborn child,
Okay.
and that's an invaluable, uh, eh, let's say, opportunity that
Definitely.
I didn't hear restaurants to provide. Let's say
No, I
so.
highly
So
doubt
so
that. I
I'm
mean, yeah, for sure. It's super interesting. And I mean, it's been a beautiful journey. I mean, listening to your, I mean, I think we can keep on going to understand, but I think we've broken down very well of how your beginnings were into food, how random in your own words, how it was, and how you've found this path, which has found the right balance for you also. I mean, you mentioned on the form that we have for guests that you mentioned that you would like to have a great impact on the bigger food system. And I feel the podcast itself is the first step for people who, because a lot of us, when we look, if I would just go to your LinkedIn, I would say, Lorenzo does this technical job at a company. I do not associate a chef with it. I just associate somebody who goes to a food tech degree, studies it. It's just in spending in labs. So for me, it's very important with these episodes to make it real that these are real people who were at kitchens. There's real people who had careers like the ones listening to it are having it right now, and a transition is definitely possible and viable, Lorenzo. But I would like to hear from you. I think you would say it much better than I could on what does impact in the food system. When you mentioned it, you want to have a positive impact, what does it mean for you? And inspired by that, what would you say to somebody who's listening, who is listening, is aware about the reality of working in restaurants, has possibly been inspired by a story like yours? What should they do to be able to realize whatever their dream is outside the restaurant food system?
Yeah, well, that's I can answer the first
Definitely.
question pretty confidently, and for me, as a chef, and as the head of R&D at Reduce today, making an impact in the food system means bringing artisanally produced, chef produced products to the market, and to available market, right? Accessibility is a key term here.
Right.
We're not doing deli products or boutique kind of products, but impact is impact at
Uh-huh.
large scale. So that for me is products that are additive free, that are wholesome. There is no chemicals in them, that taste like something that you can relate to.
Of course.
And I think it's that's what impact means for me. And I think it's a very hard, in fact, objective to pursue at this point in time. And I think for people that are listening, I said a lot of time random and circumstantial
Uh-huh.
events that happened to me while I dropped out from dropping out from university in Rome in 2013 to getting a job at Reduced. I said many times how random things kind of happen in your day to day, and the bridges start connecting to each other. But ultimately, like, to those listening, I would say that there is in us something that drives us on a day to day, that makes us wake up in the morning and do our job, with passion and drive and motivation. And I think I had that too, and I have it too still today. And I think is to follow that, because there isn't actually no random event. There isn't things happen because we kind of create those opportunities. And so following that internal gut feeling or that motivation, whatever it is, that makes us feel good and upbeat about our day to day is definitely what to pursue and what brought me here today. Regardless of the educational background or the experiences, is kind of believing in these steps as formative steps, as something that we need to do, and not being afraid of changing or taking the less conventional paths here.
Definitely. I mean, I couldn't say it better, Lorenzo, and I've loved everything you've shared. Especially for me, the biggest highlight was what you said about making accessible change, because again, a lot of these products that you're talking about can somehow feel that they make impact, but then make it just within a bubble. So I feel the greater vision that Reduced has of making this accessible for the masses, I feel is a beautiful vision, and I feel your episode has been super inspirational for everybody listening. I can just speak for myself. I mean, how you've proven this path, and also the words that you said about following that instinct and going ahead with it and believing in yourself to make those steps. I mean, it did happen randomly that you ended up at Noma, but again, it requires the guts and the instinct to knock those doors, to put your foot into them, however difficult they are, and that the collective impact of those events causes what looks random today. I think it's because of a lot of intentional steps taken towards that dream. So Lorenzo, thanks so much again for making time on this special leave that you have for being on the podcast, and
For sure.
we hope to stay connected.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Furqan. It was a pleasure to share, and hopefully, this will lead to a lot of other meaningful conversations. So I wish you a really good day and nice to meet you.
Thank you so much.